conference. When we organized this Congress, we thought that there were a couple of topics, as we have listened before. One of them was the transformation of this new city, which is called the touristic city, which is not exactly a city, but a conglomerate of urban operations of different developments taking shape and maturing in a kind of a strange way. Who is the best expert in this? Well, there are very few experts who have studied architecture tourism and who have reflected around this subject of landscape. One of them, one of the few ones that we have from an international perspective, is no doubt Bernard Toulier. Bernard Toulier is a historian of architecture and member of the French Academy in Rome in the 80s, and he's now an expert of architectonic heritage of the 19th and 20th century in Europe and Africa, responsible for the program of architecture of the towers of the house and summer housing of the National Center of Scientific Research in France, and he continues his research in the field of spa architecture. And one of the actions that he has done more recently, I would like to underline the most recent one in 2017, where he's the commissioner of the exhibition, of a magnificent exhibition entitled Tous à la plage, everybody to the beach, spa cities of the 19th centuries to our dates in 2017. And then in the most reduced version, it's an itinerary exhibition along France. So this exhibition was not only a magnificent exhibition celebrated at the City of Architecture and French Heritage in Paris, but also gave as a result a publication with a magnificent text by Bernard Toulier, where we can see a magnificent material for the different researches that are very interesting for us as architects, and the territorial transformation of the implementation of tourism. To conclude, let me just say that Bernard Toulier is a honorary general conservator of the French heritage, Cité du Patrimoine in Paris. He has the floor, and we thank him for his presence.
All right. Yes, I did have some problems to share my screen, because now when I'm trying to share my screen, I cannot find my PowerPoint that I had prepared for you. So let's see if I can find it, if I can find the PowerPoint. Let's see.
Bernard, otherwise I got the PowerPoint, so I might share it for you.
Yes, it would be great to share Mr. Toulier's file. It would be excellent if somebody else could share it, because Bernard Toulier has some problems. So do we have to? Okay, that's excellent. Perfect. So yeah, this is perfect. So I think everybody can see the shared screen properly. Yes, you can see that, right? Everybody's able to. So it's perfect. Is it working for the participants as well? Is it all right? Yes, I think we can proceed. I think that we're all receiving the right screen.
Yes,
everything is correct.
We received the
Yeah,
right
everything is
screen.
correct. Let's move on. All right, so this is about the mass summering in France. This is starting in 1925 at the time of a worldwide crisis, and it ends in 1975 with another, the second worldwide crisis, with the first crisis, oil crisis, that really transformed the economy and trade at an international level. So when it comes to landscape and tourism, these two phenomena are really important to understand the transformation, because the crisis in 29 transforms those summer holidays. And there's also the deletion of casinos, and this first generation of those pavilions near the coast gives place to mass tourism and much more specialized destinations. So this popular clientele is replaced by a clientele of privileged people, and this has an unprecedented impact on urban planning and architectural programs, both in France, but also in the Western world and also in the Northern Hemisphere. Everybody is there fascinated by these summer possibilities. Next slide, please. So in the 30s, the idea of these coastal areas is taken up by authoritarian regimes. And in 1932, in Barcelona, for instance, there's the GATT Pact. And the GATT Pact starts several projects, such as, for example, the project of a new city at the border of Barcelona, but this project never takes place. Next. So here near Ruggen, there's the architect Clemens Klotz, who designed a spa for 20,000 workers, and he's building a gigantic station, which is partly executed during war, and then it's interrupted. The construction is interrupted by the war, and the workers go to that station to rest. And you can see the poster here, and not only those workers are benefiting from the coastal environment, but also at these stations there are several rooms to celebrate festivities and rooms for gathering, and the workers gather there also to listen to political discourses. Next slide, please. Next. Here we have the Italian National Party that promotes summer camps for children at the coast. And here I chose a summer camp that was organized by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to receive the children of Italian soldiers. Here in England, in 1936, there's this private initiative to build some pavilions in order to just to receive communities of workers, and there are certain central spaces as well for gathering. Now for France, we have another example. For instance, here we have the 4th of June, 1936. We have this construction, and this is a kind of summer camp or summer colony. This is in 1936, at the time of the 40-hour working week. And at those times, well, there's this summer camp to receive and to welcome children to spend the summer. And we have this example here in the region of the Landes in France. And it's true that all this leads to reflection in some other countries that only start this process after the war. So this popular summer holidays is based on campsites and the development as well of the car. So the development of cars. Cars have a very important role to play when it comes to organizing tourism lanes and tourism flows. This mass tourism depends very much on the use of cars. This is what our summer holiday people use to move to their destinations. Here, this is Henri Prost, an architect who has prescribed some aesthetic measures to save the landscape. This is a mountain chain, and here we are preserving the structure of the buildings, but we're just building all this along the road, and this is between Marseille and Ventimiglia. So again, here we can see once more the prevalence of cars, the use of cars, and this is taking after the example of American tourism flows. So the landscape in France is very much influenced by the use of cars. This is after the war. Here we have coaches as well and buses. This is a magnificent picture by Robert Doisneau. And here it's about moving adults and children along the coast. And here, family displacements, family movements. Here we've got a car and the family, but also the tents in order to camp. This is the Sable d'Olonne. And the automobile is then, of course, shaping our highways. This is a vector of the economy up till 1979. This is the Southern Highway. This is called the Sun Highway. And we can see here all the family cars, all the old Citroën, the new DS, which is next to it, the two CV Citroën. This is the highway between Paris and Marseille, but there's also the Côte d'Azur highway that was built at that time. So all this is transforming the coastal landscape. And then in 1963, Jean Balladur and Roger Vian, an engineer, are studying the layout of a new tourism units in Languedoc for 70% of tourists. And this access is done via the road network. So this is again to welcome summer tourists. And these resorts will be connected by roads, and we can see here all the range and all the layout of these highways. And we can see that Balladur and then the engineer as well were building their resorts according to the flow of the highways. So we are seeing the road flow in this picture, and we see all the different units of summer sites that are flourishing and that are swanning at this time. And we're moving from a wetland landscape to an urban landscape with a lot of marine ports and recreational ports in order to welcome German tourists and Italian tourists, or all those tourists also that are moving south towards Spain. This was damaging France, actually, and then de Gaulle decides to block that tourism flow that was moving southwards towards Spain, and the government decides to block that and to try to keep tourists in France. So there's an important budget allocated for the construction of all these resorts. Here we can see the main boulevard 600 meters away from the front line in the coast. So actually we are not thinking on the coastal line. We want to use this coastal landscape in order to place there all the different marina and all the different buildings and resorts. And this is also going to be the case for the Atlantic side of the coast in the Landes. So this is really the transformation of the French coast, both in the Mediterranean and in the Atlantic. And here we can see the consequences. Well, this is what happens when you can really make your car reach the front line. We can see all these little units that are placed in the wetlands of Languedoc-Roussillon. And we can see this advertisement here. It was advertised in August 1964 with all these new resorts. And the year after, there were 1 million tourists in this area coming to these wetlands. And we can see as well that the Concorde was, we see that all this planning is actually a way to reach this area. We can see even in the picture an image of the Concorde in order to move to this area. So really this photograph is a photograph for mass tourists, but this is of course today a little bit obsolete, and it's also really a little bit comical for us nowadays, but well, this is something that happened in the 60s. Next. So here, these cars, you know, of course, when you're moving by car, you need motels in order to park your car. Or of course, if you're traveling by plane, you need airports, and the Touquet airport was designed in order to make British planes land. And here next to the Touquet, we have the road with all these motels scattered around the area. And we can see here this golf court as well that was built at that time. This is really after the American model. And this American model was something really implemented in France as well as a symbol of this renovation. And we can see how summer tourists were using this model. We're not really talking in this case about a massive or a really massive tourism. We're rather talking about summer tourism who could afford the car, who could afford taking the plane. So here we've got the roads, we've got the motels, we've got the pump station or the gas station in order to supply our cars. And this is the perfect formula for the average summer tourist with a car. So again, here another practice that shows the symbiosis between tourism and cars. It's the campsite, the camping place. Here we've got these little bungalows, and they're quite humble, they're quite modest. But so we see here all these rows of bungalows, and they're displayed in this way, in an oblique way, in order to get the better orientation compared to the sun. So you can reach this camping site by car, and you can park your car outside, and then you can just spend the summer in this small bungalow or in a tent. And we can see that this is quite precarious, but this is again another landscape. And this kind of camping sites are developed after the 50s. So we're moving from the little town to the bungalow. Here, another example, a little bit more sophisticated in architectural terms. Here, this is another example of integration. We've got here this magnificent bungalows, or, you know, this kind of units. This is an architecture that is still still in place today. And so we've got this little unit with a little bit of grass at the front door. It's quite innovative in the 70s, and at the same time it's quite well integrated in the landscape. So this is a significant element of a modern architecture that is integrated for campers. And here we're talking about Mers-les-Bains in Picardy, in the coast of the region of Picardy. So this welcomes summer tourists as well. And this is very famous among work councils in large manufacturing companies, like in the car industry. All these workers spend their summer in this kind of places. So the companies are really investing very much in building this kind of resorts. So this was excellent to receive workers during the summer, and there were even several units to welcome children of those workers and to organize activities for them. So this is a new model, and this is a unit that is very well integrated in the landscape. Another example of this, we find these units that are totally integrated in the slope, in the hill, and they, in this case, the units do not reach the sea, the front line, they do not reach that. We have these family cells, and they're turned towards the sea, but we've also got the cliffs here. And well, we've got the Atelier de Montrouge, and we've got all these different resorts, holiday resorts in the Côte d'Azur. And again, in this case, it's all very well integrated in the hill. Here, another village, which is designed for workers and for the staff of Air France in the 70s. Now we have these terrace buildings in the Gulf of Saint-Tropez. And today, these buildings are still visible, and they're in a perfect condition. In 1965, the family association called Renouveau has decided to build this kind of resorts in mountain places for for the winter holidays in Courchevel, for instance, and in other sites, in other mountain sites. So we find these modular villages, which are really surprisingly modern. Even nowadays, they look so modern. And this is in the 60s. So this is Henri Mouette and Pierre Schiavelli. They're organizing this kind of village in the southern part of France. So it is a new kind of construction at the seafront with this modern architecture, all made for leisure. It's all trying to integrate these resorts in the landscape. And so there's obviously two kind of phenomena here. There's a phenomena based on concrete, on big buildings at the front line. And there's this second phenomena, this alternative resorts that are integrated in the landscape. All this requires an important organization. And here we have another example. This is what we call VVS, Village Vacances Famille. So it's the family holiday town. And this is a project subsidized by different saving banks in France. And the project was to build 400 resorts such as this one along the coastline in France. Here we have an example in the Basque coast. It's at the north of Biarritz in Anglais. And in this case, we have Jean-Raphaël Ebrard and André Grézy, who are building this resort that resembles a ship. So here we've got this construction. This is smooth concrete, and along this construction there's also a series of installations and facilities for children, and this is just to welcome family summer tourists. And we've got here a space to receive buses coming from the train station, and these buses will transport all these families, even though cars are also possible. Getting there by car is still possible. And here, so we've got this example, lots of towns here, summer holiday towns. We've got another example in Brittany. And so we've got several examples of these architects who are designing their buildings in the shape of a ship. And this is quite an innovative way to start this mass tourism. And here, well, I was talking about the VVF, about the family holiday towns, but there's also the magnificent example of Club Med. Here we've got an example in Morocco. We've got this animator here who's working, and he's trying to animate some activities. And we've got this resort which is made of different little bungalows with their own terrace, and there's a community restaurant right in the middle with modern architecture. And this reminds us of some traditional material that are used in Morocco. This is all made to fascinate tourists, but at the same time, it's made to make people dream of this sea line, of this coastline. And this is right after the Second World War, when there was this economic blooming of France, and everybody wanted to visit and to go overseas with the Club Med and to spend 15 days of their summer holidays tanning or having group activities. So here we've got this phenomenon. It's after the 50s, and we've got these summer towns for the Club Med. So this is in Agadir, and this is a very clear example.
Next, this mass leisure industry, which is based on sand and sea, gives rise to holiday villages of a new type. Next, please. Where is the screen? Okay. We have the naturism clubs, which are called kind of marine and sun villages. In French, we say hélio-marin. This is where the bodies can see the sun, and also this very big circular building that will take some years to be built. It has been designed and created by the architect François Lopez, who is going to bring in these small units the different families that want to benefit from the sun. We can see here these small windows, and in the external part, in the outer part, all these small units that are going to be present in the Cap d'Agde next to the Mediterranean. It is a very massive circular building in the shape of an amphitheater in 1974 that is going to be published and disseminated in all architecture magazines. It is called the Heliopolis because here Helios has to really give back force and energy to the French tourists who want to spend their days in Cap d'Agde. It's a new experience that we have on the coast, and they are mainly carried out by the state. Here on this slide, you can see other buildings that are built by other states. This is not a situation only for France. Until 1958, in France, we have the Ministry of Reconstruction and Urban Development, which is mainly responsible for the new stations. And in 1959, Pierre Sudreau, the new minister, proposes to explore the coastal territory to undertake major development work, mainly in foreign countries. With a team of architects, they are going to visit mainly the United States, but also the countries in Central and so-called Eastern Europe, and also along the Black Sea. And this team is going to visit in Romania the striking examples of Mamaya, designed by several architects. Balladur wants to visit Romania and Mamaya, and they take these Romanian examples as an inspiration. Examples from Romania, but also Bulgaria, as you can see on the pictures. This is Alba Nena in Romania. We have a station that is built during the 60s, between the 60s and 70s. And here we are recuperating these elements of sun, tourist houses, bungalows. Well, not so much sun, but as you can see, it's quite modern and horizontal architecture that we also find on contemporary architecture. And French architects are going to be mainly inspired for the Languedoc-Roussillon by these Romanian and Bulgarian examples. Next slide. We can see here several missions in Languedoc-Roussillon. We have here other elements of the marina with this futurist architecture that is presented to the French population. It is a new station with a new landscape that is half on sticks and half of it on marshlands. And we will have here a landscape typical of the coastline that we can also see in science fiction novels that are very in fashion at the time. And we also have this marina uh, for this new station, gigantic, giant structures where we can see the new principles with all these units that are going to be built by the end of the 60s until the end of the 70s. During a decade, a whole series of new villages, new tourism villages are going to be built. It is the Languedoc-Roussillon who is going to prepare their lands, and this is the result of a new urban planning policy. It is mainly the result of a centralized state such as France. It's not really private. It's a giant project, more than 180 kilometers on a flat and unspoiled, swept by the winds territories where we have mosquitoes coming from the marshlands. They are going to create a tourist region made up of a series of resorts in intervals of 50 kilometers served by a motorway where we will be crossing the area with very small boats that connect one unit with the other, and we will move around all these hectares thanks to these small boats. It is close to the Spanish border on an urbanized area of 600,000 hectares, and the idea is to attract all these tourists coming from the north. The aim is to rebalance the tourists in France along the French coast, especially attracting them to the Côte d'Azur, which is starting to become full and densified, and we are going to create a new touristical pole that will receive more than 2 million tourists. An interministerial mission is created for the development of the Languedoc-Roussillon region, shared by Pierre Racine. And 5 new towns are proposed at the time, all designed by very well-known architects. As you know, Georges Candelis already was very experienced in Mediterranean architecture. We also have Jean Balladur, Jean Lecouteur, Raymond Glaise, Édouard Hartanet, and especially in the Aude region, Pierre Lafitte and Henri Castel. These new integrated stations were considered as an alternative to models more traditional, which were characterized by the lack of order. This model of Brighton, the English model, is here replaced by a new kind of French style model, not so much an American model, which is going to create these new science fiction villages. We will have here, very in the fashion of these times, several elements of harbor structures with very big pyramids, as you can see here. These pyramids already existed alongside the coast of the Black Sea. The architect took as an example the very big pyramids of Mexico. That's what we think. But in fact, the reality is that the examples were taken from Europe, but with an ornamental architecture which is much more attractive. And this kind of architecture is going to multiply all the spaces for the beach and also for the harbor, with a boulevard which is not really like the structuring boulevard that we used to have in the past. The architectural treatment of these 4 tourist units is going to be very varied. The coasts of Languedoc-Roussillon will host the urban architecture of the pyramids, but also the morphological type fantasies of Georges Candelis in Le Cat Baccarès. as he did in Morocco. And the description proposed by Jean Le Couture in Cap d'Agde reveals this new architecture with this kind of wave. And Jean Le Couture here on this other picture is much more traditional. We are going to reproduce here the typical Provence villages with this facade here, with these very small leisure harbors which are on the front line. On the one hand, the futurism, on the other hand, the regionalism and even the modern architecture. But everyone will have his own style, his particular style, which is going to be a very characteristic. And Jean Le Couture will say, everything must contribute in Cap d'Agde to providing its inhabitants a human scale and an architecture without pretensions or complexes. And it has to really benefit from all the elements of comfort of our time, but it has also to integrate into the landscape of the 70s. And it has to recall the specific character of Mediterranean villages, as you can see here. And the idea is to avoid falling into the pastiche that would be nothing more than a caricature. Of course, we cannot really be mistaken. It is really a pastiche, but the idea is not to create this pastiche, but to design Mediterranean villages with very small elements on a human scale. For some of the stations, this case, the case of Cap d'Agde, can be reproduced, and it will be reproduced in other touristical stations very well known in France. The interministerial mission that worked here, for example, on the Languedoc-Roussillon coast, it is the first coast that was developed by the state. The state had decided to refurbish the coastline in France. We started first of all here, and then the state moved on the coast of Les Landes. We can see here some elements of this area of Le Côte des Landes, but it's going to be very limited, because the operation that was started in the 70s in reality really took off in 1975. But in any case, these interventions aimed at creating units of urban landscape. The idea was to bind all these unities with several roads that are not going to be on the marine facade, because the idea is to facilitate the access to the sea and also to the beach. And in the hinterland, the idea is to really insist on this more lake landscape, because we want to live in the hinterland, the old villages that used to exist along the forests. That's what we will have on the Aquitaine coast. And during 20 years, the idea is to change the landscape. We have here an example, the example of Courtin. It is, as you can see here, during the 70s, that's the result. We have the small lake, the forest, and the old Louctan. And here, all along the lake, a new tourism village is going to be built with a leisure harbor and a real kingdom for children and for sports passionates, because especially along the Les Landes coast. And these small towns is going to give way to the landscape. The idea is to keep the Les Landes forest and also to avoid big concrete constructions. This is going to be built not directly on the coastline. All these will be built in Les Landes until the 80s. It's going to be a very long refurbishment project. In the end, the state will have no money to continue this project, but with the help of some saving banks and some allowances, family allowances banks, they try to carry out some other minor initiatives. There will be a whole series on these coasts of kind of villages such as this one, whose aim is to modernize the area. I think I still have 15 minutes left to present you.
You can use 15 minutes or more if you need.
Well, I would rather to have a debate and discussion, and I'd like to answer some questions if there are. Well, as I was saying, the examples of this interministerial mission that was at the heart of the 30 glorious years, they are always going to be difficult to implement in other places except the Languedoc-Roussillon. We can consider that the works have been carried out, but every day there will be fewer architects interested in that. And as you can see, Les Landes and also the Languedoc-Roussillon coast wanted to stop the tourists from moving to Spain. The idea was to attract people to the French coast. And these two places were the result of a political investment on behalf of the French government to make a kind of, to create hurdles for the French tourists who used to go to Spain to spend their holidays, because they considered Spain a cheaper place and a place where sun was guaranteed. And finally, on the new program of the marinas, we have these very famous concrete walls that start to scatter everywhere and become the object of several controversies. We will have very high buildings with some boats here for every one of the flats. They are inspired in the American style, in the big buildings that we find in the neighborhoods in France, but also in the United States. And the idea was to use the pyramid shape and to make them round so that they are better integrated in the landscape. We have here, for example, Villeneuve-Loubet, where at the end of the 60s, we will see for the first time these new elements that are going to set up a new and create a new bay. We will have some architectural elements that will be designed, specially conceived and designed for the sun. We are going to build balconies. These balconies will really filter the sunlight, and on the other hand, these buildings on terraced land for the tourists to park, to moor their boats. These kind of buildings are going to flourish all around the Atlantic coast, also in the southern coast, next to Nice, on the Mediterranean coast as well, close to the Nice harbor, which is going to give a modern style to these very big tourist villages. We have here the Marina Belles Anges with 550 docking points, mooring points, and so as I was saying, a port of with 550 docking points is built, and this kind of marinas are going to be multiplied along the coast. Today, we have roughly some hundreds of mooring points, and at the end of the 30 glorious years, there were more than 100,000 mooring points in France. You can see here the architecture of these very big structures with individual architecture of Jean Le Couven. We also have Françoise Poëri, during the 60s here in a wetland area. It is not very expensive to design here. Françoise Poëri was the promoter of this area, and over these marshlands, these elements are going to be built. And as you can see, we will have these very small boats in front of the different flats and houses. It's going to be a real success. François Spoeri will be the leader. He will be really at the front line of a generation of architects who are going to build marinas, not only in Canada, but also in the United States. And also today, we have really tourist agencies in the heritage of Françoise Poëri who are still working on the eastern part of the Mediterranean. And today, the Chinese have really recuperated this idea, and they do carry out this type of works, this type of marinas. And we have these, finally, this regionalist marina. In fact, the idea is to here to go back to individualism. The idea was to forget the big mass tourist structures. We are not going to merge anymore in a local population, very diversified. It's just the opposite. Now we have the means to create several walls, barriers, and every kind of island is like a club. And the people who would be closer to the beach, where we have to pay more for the land and for the house, there will be closed fences with private barriers and private walls with standpoints and balconies over the exterior. The idea is to have this kind of fortress style with very big walls, so that the privileged classes can come here. And meanwhile, mass tourism takes place in Saint-Tropez. But here we have a privileged tourism who is going to reconquer spaces, and who is going really to recuperate what we are going to call the lake cities. The word marina is rejected because it was associated to the United States, and that's why they favor this new name, the lake cities, for these very accommodated people who want to spend their holidays in front of the sea and with their boats. We will have, to keep the story short, on the one hand, people of La Grande Motte with a modern architecture, and on the other hand, an architecture much more with some hectares which has been created, set up for the bourgeoisie, for the bourgeois classes in France. We have our regression, new Provençal for some, and this operation of Port Grimaud becomes the symbol for architects. It is the result of promoters and also agents. Architects in general fancy in France working on these modern tourist villages, but promoters know that if we add some regionalist touches, everything is going to be much better sold, at least in France. So regionalism during these 30 glorious years still had a lot of future and still has today. But all this story has some limits. And the limit of the 30 glorious years will be the state. The state is exhausted and it cannot encourage, foster the tourism policy anymore. We have during the 30 glorious years the concept of mass tourism, popular mass tourism. But this idea of having a beach for everyone, so that everyone has a balcony over the sea, is considered a symbol of success in the modern era. And next slide. After the first oil crisis, the initiatives launched by the centralized state are exhausted, they are tired. We have all these anarchic constructions alongside the coast. This is disastrous for the environment. And these virgin regions of wetlands are going to become new cities. We will see different units, many units that are built, but little by little, these units are replaced by new buildings on the green spaces. After the end of the 30 glorious years, as we can see here, during the 80s, we are going to speak of architectural imperialism. And we will ask the question, is it really the answer, the solution for the Languedoc-Roussillon? We are going to mix the architectural style together with the political style. And the first ecologists are starting to shout and to say no to concrete, yes to nature. And that's why during the 80s, or by the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, we will see that this mass tourism is going to change, and building at less than 500 meters from the beach will be forbidden. And that's the reason why the state funds will be used to buy pieces of the beach where we will have natural spaces and no buildings anymore. Today, 30% of the coastline has been bought by the state, so that we do not have buildings such as those of the glorious 30 years. This has increased the price of these buildings, and also allows for the state to protect the space, the natural space, and it also helps the state to rebalance ecology and construction. That's the reason why these lake cities will put an end to the public investments, and we will have now private investment. But in France, we now are in a tendency to recuperate natural sites, and we do not want these kind of villages anymore. That's why in the 90s we will have new coast villages that are going to be built 5 or 10 kilometers away from the coastline, because if the seafront is protected, nevertheless we can still build on the hinterland. And that's why in the Côte d'Oral and other, we have a new villages, private villages for privileged tourism that is multiplied in the inland and not so much on the seafront. That's the new tendency in the 2000. And the new mass tourism will be the tourism associated to the low cost, mainly fostered by airlines, which decrease prices so that Britons, French, and the Germans can come from their countries and spend their holidays next to the coast, and they can spend their holidays next to the beach. Of course, today the health crisis and the environment crisis have closed. They have shut down all borders, and I believe this is going to be the reason why we will see a renewal of the leisure sector, and with the working labor, something that we need today to really get over the economic crisis. Thank you so much. It's 10:30 now. I will be glad to answer your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It was a great presentation. We are almost envious of this architectonical experience in France, this architecture that is sometimes marvelous and sometimes awful, that just presented us. And now the debate is open in many different ways. I will try to moderate it, and I would love to make you some questions too. And questions about this French experience, and questions about the policies behind all this development at the seaside. Enrico, just tell us how to proceed.
So if you have any question, especially participants, there is a button with a hand drawing with a hand icon, so you can click in it and we will receive a notification and we will give you the floor. Otherwise, you can write your question in the chat.
Okay, to start with, I have plenty of questions, but one that is quite straightforward. What can we learn from this, the first experience as a balneary experience, the first experience? And when mainly now that we are living this health crisis of COVID, and the spas, the balneary sites are created to relax and to heal. And we are quite in a similar situation. We have no vaccine and no cure to COVID. So how this first experience of balneary or spa could help us now to overcome this crisis?
well, these summer spas, yes, they're born out of sickness and disease, and water was the regenerative element. But water was the element to really regenerate and to really regain health. Now here at this time, you know, there were in Great Britain and in Northern European countries, we were trying to repair the body by using thermal waters and spas. And that took place at the end of the 18th century. And yes, we were trying by the use of thermal waters to have some kind of mass tourism, but mass tourism within privileged classes. And there was, together with that, an urban system, architectural system. And yeah, people would go towards the sea, to the sea line, to take some sea baths that would regenerate that person from tuberculosis, for instance. And then this is what we saw in the Atlantic coast, but also in the Côte d'Azur. People were there for bathing and for sunbathing as well in order to heal from disease. And this is what happened in the past. And we're trying through these thermal water resorts to try to find natural remedies. I think today, between the first lockdown and the second lockdown, I think most French people have decided to move towards the sea line as well. And again, once more, the coastline, once more in France, in Europe, and in the entire world, the coastline and the use of the sea has this healing component in order to, you know, to compensate for this health crisis. And it is in the coastline that people seek refuge.
The second question I would love to do is about the American influence. You were talking about this mimesis in Europe from the American experience, and our research didn't get quite conclusive results. For example, when Puerto Banús in Andalusia is opened for the touristic jet set coming to Spain, two directors of different marinas are invited of the Esmeralda Coast. It's therefore is not the American experience, but the exclusive experience of a marina at the seaside with casinos, as Monte Carlo is, and the exclusivity above all, and in fantastic thesis from one of our colleagues, we discovered there were some influence of Harvard, but very exclusive influences. You can see the direct influence of the motel, which is an American invention, but it's hard for me to find other examples of what you've said of the American influence.
Well, I think that the American model came to us through both wars actually, and Spain was, may I say, was fortunate enough to keep aside the First and the Second World War, if I may say so. And I would say that in our case, American people came to France twice in the century during the two world wars. So the first consequence of all of this is that during the 20s, there were lots of injured and wounded soldiers from America who came to the Côte d'Azur in order to seek health. And all this led to this summer tourism. We see Fitzgerald, for instance, who would spend holidays in the Côte d'Azur. And it's the American people that make several Côte d'Azur towns reopen in order to welcome these summer American tourists. And the second case of that is after the Second World War. And there we were just experiencing the Marshall Plan, and our wartime efforts came together with American credit. And then there is this wave of Americanization with the construction of highways, and we didn't have that before. And in Germany, there's no such model, but in France, everybody turned their eyes towards America, towards the United States of America. And that's why we adopted Marina, for example, this leisure and recreational ports. And we see as well that we're just turning our eyes towards the United States. And this is a myth. It's true, but it's there. I mean by this that we're not turning our eyes to the leisure model in Russia or in satellite countries, especially during the mandate of de Gaulle, of General de Gaulle. We're just turning our eyes to the other side of the Atlantic. We're just turning our eyes to America and the way they're trying to put in place their leisure. And it's true that we're turning our eyes to Russia and to Eastern countries when it comes to other aspects, but it is not possible to admit so. So that's why we say that we turn our eyes and we get inspired by the American leisure. And for instance, in Royan, there's this new summer town that was built and reshaped after the modern architectural sites from the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. So this new summer resort in Royan is imitating one that was at the other side of the Atlantic. So it's true, there are certain myths, but there are many realities. And it's true that the recreational ports are a clear example of what happened in America, for instance. And there were so many in America, in the States. But now we tried to implement it to implement them in France as well, under the influence of America. So does it answer your question?
Yes, indeed. There is a question.
Pues Mónica nos pregunta.
Monica is asking.
Bueno, muchas gracias por su magnífica explicación.
Thank you very much for your great explanation.
Un comentario en referencia al contexto y actual y a los lugares de renovación del ocio. Se está planteando en Francia la recuperación de determinados lugares históricos turísticos como posibles nuevos destinos, y especialmente refiriéndome tanto a los balnearios de costa como a los balnearios históricos de interior, ya que también fueron clave en un periodo histórico en el que se trataba de mejorar ciertas condiciones de salud. Siendo el contexto actual comparte algunas características con este periodo, ¿Pueden los balnearios proporcionar algún tipo de respuesta
we are
a la
living
crisis
in that
actual
is
de los
similar
destinos
in
turísticos?
some ways to that period? Can balnearies or spas can give some kind of answers?
Well, I really do not know if this thermal water resorts are the response, but it is true that I have two examples to give you as a scientist. First of all, there is the internationalization of thermal water spas and resorts. And there's during the recovery in Spain, what we call the recuperación here in Spain, there was the recovery of old water thermal stations as elements of our legacy, of our heritage. And we're trying to adapt them to a worldwide heritage. For instance, there's the example of Nice, which was the capital for that in France, and it was the capital of the summer resorts. And Nice is placed nowadays as an international destination, and it's part of the international heritage. Because what happens today in Nice is that some Chinese companies come all together to the Promenade des Anglais to just walk along the boulevard, because it's in our mind. It's in our mind that there are these old cities that are part of the summer heritage, and these old cities are the ones to turn backwards to. So another example of this, all of Europe has tried to make a list of 10 different thermal stations that will be part of the World Heritage, like Bar or Spa or Vichy. And these 10 towns, famous for their thermal waters, are candidate to be part of the World Heritage. So the city of Arda, with the thermal water station, is nowadays a modern station. And in the Havre, 15 years ago, there were no tourists for the waters. However, nowadays we have 1.2 million tourists just coming to visit the city because of those thermal waters. So there's this new world heritage. And there's also the city of Brighton, which was twice a candidate to be in this list of the World Heritage for thermal waters, and it failed twice. But there are many different cities that are placing their candidacy for that, because it is a way to regenerate these towns and to modernize these old thermal stations.
Professor Manuel Gausa has written several texts in French.
So congratulations, Bernard Toulier. This is a great... Yes, sorry. So congratulations, Mr. Toulier. This is a great presentation that tells us about the social and political evolution, and together with the evolution of architecture, also with our alternative examples. And this is a case where we can see all the different typologies of architecture and new territories. Even though there are similar experiences, I'm sorry, I cannot translate because somebody else has their micro unmuted. so I couldn't hear the question properly or the comment properly. It is a comment, it's not a question. But there's the importance of this link in your presentation is crucial for Spain. In Spain, we use the seaside to live there, and we move to the beach and we go shopping in the small towns, and this has to do with our way of living. The COVID, I'm really having trouble to hear the question. I cannot read the question. I'm sorry, the importance of this link between the town and the beach, it's intense and it's fantastic in Spain. We spent some time at the beach, and can you see the text? Yes, yeah, it's a very interesting remark, and it's true that today you know, my last journey before lockdown was actually a journey to a thermal station that I know very well. And I remember that the beach was closed and we all had to wear our masks to go to the beach. Well, to go to the seafront, let's say, because as I'm saying, the beach was locked and it was and it was guarded by the police and by the army. And it's true that after the excesses of the French population in August, and well, this led to a second wave of the pandemics. And these led the beaches to be considered as a vehicle for contamination of the virus. And now, in this mindset, we're going to keep all these spaces locked. It's all these spaces where there was mass tourism. And the main expression of this mass tourism is the beach. But also I can tell you of another example. You know, not far from where I live, there's this famous race called Vendée Globe, and it is a race between different sailors, and they sail their boats. Well, all of this is locked down nowadays, and all the racers have to sail there without any kind of public or viewers. But well, today any kind of social life depends very much on spaces for outdoor spaces for summer holidays. We know that 60% of the French population spend their holidays in the seaside. And this will remain the same even after lockdown. And in Europe or in China, most major cities are cities along the coast, cities with harbors where people live turned towards the sea. And it's true that in far Eastern European countries, everything happens around water and along water. Everything is related to water. And today we have this summer station towns, we have this port towns, and this is going to remain even after our crisis. And here we have another question.
Okay, we have a question from Katerina. I will allow you to talk so you can straight do your question. Yes.
Okay, so thank you very much for this intervention. I am a PhD student, and I was studying port stations that were built during the 30 glorious years in France and in Italy. And I found many common things on different aspects. For instance, the funding of these resorts and the gigantic aspect of these resorts and the role of governments. So I wanted to ask you, have you ever thought about this parallel situation between certain sea sites and mountain sites? Again, in order to prepare my PhD, I'm trying to understand how architects, well, they do not only invent buildings, but they're shaping the landscape and the territory. And architects and urban developers have to deal with the issue of the soil and the land geology. That is all the geological aspects of the terrain, and also how to build water supplies for all of this. And when reading archives, I had the impression that sometimes architects lack the awareness to deal with these issues, especially when they're working in mountain sites. So this is just my impression. I would like to know your opinion on this. And I would like to know your opinion, for instance, about thermal water stations where architects have to put in place an entire transformation of the environment in order to make all these projects feasible. Thank you very much for your question. Actually, it is true that both kind of holiday sites in the 30 glorious years, they take place together and they're concomitant, and they are very much influenced by the French politics. The development of the territory by France, by the Datar, you know, there was first of all the first interministerial mission on mountain sites, even before there was one mission concerning coastal sites. So but both missions, they're led by the same group of people, by the same ministry. It's the Ministry for Reconstruction that was in charge of this data, of this huge project to build holiday sites, both in the mountain and in the coastline. So it is absolutely normal that you find these parallel situations and these common points. And secondly, I would say that it's the same funding mechanisms that are put in place. The state appoints the saving case or the saving bank. And this saving bank is appointed to finance and to provide the investment necessary for the building of these resorts, both in the mountain and in the coastline. And after that, there's a group of architects that are appointed also, and they're required to have the same kind of awareness when it comes to building both programs. They're always going to be asked to respect the integration in the terrain, in the territory, regardless whether we're talking of a wetland or a mountainside. They're always required to to respect the territory and to have as much an integration as possible. And also within all these groups, there's always the presence of engineers and geologists, and there's always a previous study that is very much developed, and it may take years before the construction starts. So these studies are going to be carried out. It's comparative studies that will be carried out in mountainsides and in all these sites that have to welcome or that have to host a resort that are going to be subject to these studies. And we will have stations, for instance, like Megève, which with Henri Jacques, for instance, which in Megève will try to imitate the local architecture, and this is what we call the pastiche architecture. But there will also be some resorts that will be modern. This is the case of Courchevel and other mountain stations where there's this alternative modern architecture. But anyway, there's all these previous studies carried out. And in my career, I studied both the phenomenon of building these mountain sides, but also the coastal sides. And we've got this piece of work which is called Tous à la plage, and it really encompasses all the results of this research. And we have examples as well of winter skiing resorts and winter sports resorts. And there's some researchers that worked in parallel, taken into account the history, the economic history, the social movements during the 30 glorious years. And this has led to this architecture that has all these characteristics. And I hope that in Spain and all the schools of architecture will keep researching on these matters at a European level. I think that comparative studies at a European level with European credit should be conducted, because we're strong enough in each country and in each field of expertise to establish a European comparison on the history of architecture for tourist sites and leisure sites. And I hope that all the people responsible who took the floor at the beginning of our presentations will carry out all these studies and research under the umbrella of Ricard Pie. Thank you very much. We're going to close the debate very soon.
To close up the debate, the last question in French.
So how to develop this
tourist city in the metropolitan
this kind of towns
place?
Well, first of all, I said it is first of all a political issue. Secondly, it is an economical and commercial issue. And thirdly, this is a problem that has to be solved respecting cultural rules and regulations, respecting the culture, the legacy, and urban development. So, you know, if a politician opens the door to all these elements, there is no reason why we couldn't develop such a place. I mean, it is always feasible to regenerate, to reconstruct, or to readapt new places for holidays in any place, in any country. But it all depends first and foremost on the willingness to have a political planning. All right.
Okay, since I'm the moderator, I would love to make a last question. to our speaker. Well, it's simply, since you know very well the French reality, is there any example of those mm, tourist stations that are becoming quarters of big cities nearby? For example, in Montpellier, they consider La Grande Motte or Cap d'Agde as a suburban area of Montpellier, and they would love to live there. This would be true for the Catalan coast, or the Catalan seaside, or the Andalusian seaside. Is there the same phenomenon? How could they keep this double aspect of tourist city and suburban area of big towns nearby, taking into account that France is 20 years
So
ahead of us?
it's pretty clear that today all the coastline in France and in Spain, well, you know, it is an agglomeration of towns. It's a continuous agglomeration of towns. It's the continuous line of different towns, and this had already been imagined by urban developers in Spain. It is just a line made of towns, and it really has different functions: residential, touristic, and so on and so forth. And within this line of coast, there is no partition, or there are no divisions other than the ones made by the landscape. And even those divisions, you know, they're made of the landscape. And it all ends up in a line. So this line, you know, regardless whether we're talking from the top of Norway till the bottom of Spain, it's a continuous line. So all these spots within the line are not isolated or closed. You know, if we're talking about the coastline of Deauville, you know, you're just 1 hour away from the city of Paris, so residents are there. And the students in Montpellier, for instance, they're living in La Grande Motte because they find a more affordable accommodation, and they take the tramway to go to the city center or to go to university. So it's true that there's this urban sites that encompass production sites, residential sites, commercial sites, and tourist sites, and it all becomes one urban environment. And the idea that was developed by the Spaniards of this continuous line city has become a reality in Villeneuve-Loubet, with where there's the recreational port. Well, we're talking about the periphery of Nice, and Monaco is also the periphery of Nice, and Nice would be the capital and Monaco would be just the peripheral area. And this can go on and on and on towards Marseille. And from Marseille, we're moving towards Roussillon, and so on and so forth. So we should now reflect on the urban development of the entire coastline instead of thinking of small sections of that coastline. And the landscape can only be understood if we take into account the interaction of all these ways of life. And we shouldn't try to divide, you know, and to isolate summer resorts, for instance, to protect them. I think this is obsolete, and that's why the UNESCO has now proposed the entire city of Nice as the legacy, as a worldwide legacy. It is the entire city of Nice, together with the old town and together with the periphery. So we've got the perspective of the entire Bay of Nice, which is now candidate for the worldwide heritage. We cannot think of small islets of landscape. It is the entire city that has to be part of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bernard Toulier. When we decided to ask you to talk, we didn't know if it would be able to count on you, but we, you are one of our friends and colleagues, and we will share information and knowledge. Thank you very much, and we'll keep in touch.